Well, exactly. So that's it going,
Yeah.
and literally is stopped. You just push the red button.
Okay.
That
And
is.
do I need to put the equipment away then? What?
I can sort that out,
Okay.
as long as this room
So
is
you're
locked.
Oh.
No, I'll just do it first thing in the morning.
Okay.
Or I'll just do it or whatever. Who's that? That would probably be better. Even if you just move the stand to the corner, and just give it to Geraldine or put it in the office or you take it. It's not a risk. So put it this way, if something happens, if it goes off, that's the power button, but it does power off immediately. But that, yeah, that's actually something important. I don't really know how to troubleshoot, so if it stops halfway. Right, okay. I'll do my best. Just now.
Well, she was responsible for science and technology policy. Agree with all 100%. Science, technology, innovation, written large, I disagree with you. These guys, Innogen, big plus a lot of Daddy looking at turning their science actually back into action.
That's it.
Canadians, it's all health.
That's okay. She agrees with you, so it's going to cause her. Well, I'm one of these people who used to go into a library. The great thing about going into a library is that you see a book and it's fixed.
Yes.
Someone tells us that, okay, grab it, you never hover. You can't read everything in your own subject.
Miles McGregor. I was born
to let other people also. Okay, so let me introduce Roger Brownsword. Some of you probably know him already. He's Professor Emeritus, I guess, at King's College.
No, actually.
Oh,
contract with King's. So
they sacked you. Roger's worked on issues of regulation of innovation for many years. The first time I knew of him, at least, he was working in Sheffield, where he worked for a long time in that Sheffield, very famous Sheffield group to technology, intellectual property, regulation and governance. And then he moved to King's College in the early 2000s, 2003.
yeah.
And I first met him actually in very auspicious surroundings because we were on different research assessment exercise panels. So we'd go to dinner and spend the whole day arguing about outputs of our academics, having tried to read their materials. I don't know how many materials they read in law. Was it 8,000?
We each had to read over 1,000
outputs.
Yeah.
And they used to look at us in development studies with, these kind of amateurs, because we were only reading about 200. And we would go in saying, oh my God, how can you read a book a day? Roger would say, but I had to read 8 books today, or something like that. So the idea of the research assessment panel being a really cerebral peer review panel, those of you who study how laboratories really work know that it isn't really like that, and the assessment process was beautiful and pure and absolutely clear, and there was no debate about any output at all. We knew absolutely how good it was as soon as we'd read it. But anyway, Roger and I would sit occasionally in order to get away from our own panels and to talk with someone who hadn't read all of this material. But apart from being on the panel, Roger's done a few other things in his life. He's been a specialist advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on Stem Cells and the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee. He was a member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics for 6 years, from 2004 to 10. He's been a Levy-Hume Research Fellow. He's been a co-editor of the Modern Law Review, still an editorial board member, and he's a founding co-editor of a new journal, Law, Innovation and Technology, which sounds like a good journal for us to get some material into. It launched in 2009. And actually, he recently took over, maybe a year or so ago, the Ethics and Governance Council of UK Biobank, from Graham Laurie. So that's an ongoing and quite a responsible task. So he's done quite a lot of things, and today he's going to talk to us about the regulatory environment. The talk is called Getting the Regulatory Environment Right with Regard to Innovation. Well, actually, it says, with regard to innovation, getting the regulatory environment right. So very welcome, Roger.
Thanks very much indeed.
Usually someone speaks for 40, 45 minutes, something like that, and then we open up for questions, and that usually takes roughly the same time. And then if people want to continue, we often go off for a drink to the bar. We'll see how that goes, but welcome. Do start, Roger.
Thanks very much indeed. Just a perfect opportunity to come and talk to you in Innogen, because I was up here in Edinburgh anyway for a meeting this morning with what was now Burkhard Schaefer's group, but was Graham's group in Script. People say, you're a funny kind of lawyer, because I always remind people I am a lawyer, but you're a funny sort of lawyer because you don't seem to understand the sort of lawyerly interests. I tried to explain my interests as being, first of all, in the context of emerging technologies, what do we need to do to get the regulatory environment right? The concept of regulatory environment is actually quite an interesting concept, but I just give a paper just talking about that. The important thing, though, really, for present purpose, is to understand that although I see the law as one of the strands within the regulatory environment, the regulatory environment that I'm talking about goes well beyond the bounds of legal interventions. And so the emphasis really is on what we need to do to get it right. The book that I wrote in 2008, Right Regulation, The Technological Revolution, identifies a number of challenges that regulators face, which are concerned with getting the regulatory environment right. These are particularly challenges to do with legitimacy and effectiveness, and keeping particularly legal forms of regulation connected to emerging technologies. I've just delivered a book to Cambridge that I co-authored with Maura Goodwin, who's a human rights lawyer based in the Netherlands, which is called Law and the Technologies of the 21st Century, in which again I'm trying to talk about the kind of challenges that regulators face. Now, I'm going to start today by rehearsing some of the features of this kind of environment that I think need to be right. I should just, sorry, this is very out of phase, but the law school in King's is in the process of moving from its old accommodation in the Strand to Somerset House, where the ambition is that we shall occupy paperless offices. And for me, that's really quite bad news, I have to say. So for some time, I've been throwing books books and papers out of my present office. And every now and then you come across something you think, oh, I didn't realise I had that. The other day I came across a report from the Better Regulation Task Force that was published in 2003, Scientific Research, Innovation with Controls. And although I don't think the body of the report is terrifically helpful, the foreword just really captures quite nicely the central issue that I want to deal with today. And in the foreword it says that the UK has a proud history of scientific research and innovation, but in an increasingly risk-averse society, this is in danger of being undermined by excessive regulation. Scientists need to have the freedom to explore avenues that open up to them, but at the same time, they need to understand and acknowledge the concerns of many within society. They should not be allowed complete freedom, especially if that freedom breaches moral, ethical or safety concerns. A properly designed regulatory regime will help achieve that balance. So I'm going to start, as I say, with talking about what I think are the key elements in a properly designed regulatory regime, a properly designed regulatory environment. We organised around some key features, and although in regulatory environments it's not always clear quite who the regulators are, if you imagine an ideal typical regulatory environment, it's clear who the regulators are. Here are 4 questions that we might put to regulators to try to hold them to account for the regulatory environment they put in place, and say, how well are you doing in relation to these 4 matters? And these 4 matters are respectively, first of all, what I call regulatory prudence. I'll explain each of these in the challenge of regulatory prudence, which does not appear as such in the 2008 book, but does appear very much so in the book that's just gone to Cambridge. So the first conversation will be about regulatory prudence. The second conversation with regulators will be about legitimacy, about regulatory legitimacy. The third will be about regulatory effectiveness. And the fourth will be about regulatory connection. So in other words, we'll be trying to hold regulators to account in relation to these matters of prudence, legitimacy, effectiveness and connection. When I just described that, I'm going to run through this again, but now in terms of what I'm going to call an innovation audit. I wish I'd thought of this phrase before I came up with the not terribly elegant title for the paper as it is, but an innovation or the innovation audit would be a much better title for this paper. This is the core of it. This is where I'm trying to get into areas that I think are new for me. And in an innovation audit, we'd be asking in a very focused way the question, what is this regulatory environment doing for scientists, for researchers, for prospective innovators? Is it impeding them? Is it helping them the way that it should be doing? How well does it do? Well, we are very much focused on innovation as the overarching purpose of regulation. What kind of an environment is this for innovators? I'll probably say a few words about Biobank as a model of sort of bottom-up regulation, but then I'll just draw to some conclusions. So the first part of this is about holding regulators to account in relation to how well they're doing, as I say, with regard to prudence, legitimacy, effectiveness and connection. And I'm starting with prudence. Now, with prudence, so this is a term that probably, what I'm going to talk about here is something you'll be entirely familiar with, but perhaps not described under this label before now. But what I'm thinking about is where technologies present, or seems though they might present risks, hazards to human health and safety or to the environment, how good a job or a satisfactory job are regulators making of ensuring that these risks are at least managed in an acceptable way? Is this a regulatory environment where, insofar as there are risks, these are acceptable risks? That's the first question we will put to regulators. What are where there are concerns about safety, human health and safety, about the environment, what are you doing about it? Have you got it right? Now, here it seems to me that we have potentially problems about a plurality of judgments that we each, as individuals, would make with regard to the safety of particular technologies. We have different judgments about the balance of, or about how risky they are in the first place, how hazardous they are, but also about how offsetting the benefits might be. My mother was very suspicious indeed of anything that involved the use of electricity. She regarded electricity as extremely dangerous and didn't really want to have appliances that used electricity. Was always very nervous about any power being on. But I mean, you can imagine a conversation in the early days of electricity where people concerned, they wanted to be sure that they weren't being exposed to unacceptable risks. Now, there are many technologies where I think it's possible for regulators just to put out the information about the hazards as they understand them and say, look, it's up to you whether you regard the risk-benefit calculations come out in a way that you think you're going to... For example, with mobile phones in the early days, are you going to be a mobile phone user or not? Do the stories about possible damage to human health here worry you? But there are many technologies, and mobile phones and electricity are included here, where, although the appliance or whatever can be used on an individual basis, it doesn't matter whether you are for it or against it, we can all live with one another. There are nevertheless infrastructural features that need to be in place before this technology can operate. So, in the case of mobile phones, it's all very well saying, look, the decision is up to you, but the phones won't work unless we have an infrastructure in place that sends the signals. And there were also concerns about health hazards for those people living in the vicinity of the masts, from transmitting the signals. And here, I think regulators face a more challenging question, because it's all very well saying, well, look, the community's view, all things considered, is that we should be going with electricity, or we should be going with air transport, or we should be going with mobile phones. It's all very well. But if you happen to live on the flight path or in the vicinity of one of these paths, the risk seems to be distributed unfairly on you. And the question for regulators there would be whether, well, not whether the risk is acceptable, all things considered, but just what they do then to offset any unfair burdens that are associated with technology. But there is also, of course, another problem with these emerging technologies, which is that the risk profile might be deeply uncertain. We just don't know sometimes exactly what the risks are. In the sense we don't know what kind of harms might be on the radar, and we might not know what the likelihood of particular harms is. And so when you're trying to do a standard risk calculation, you build a risk profile on both axes, i.e. the kind of harm and the probability or likelihood of that harm eventuating. There are big question marks. It's also true, of course, I think, that you can have similar uncertainties in relation to the benefits. Innovators do like to talk up the benefits of their technologies, understandably so. But even if you apply a kind of natural discount against that, there is still going to be genuine uncertainty about just how beneficial this might be, and again, how likely it is that the benefits will eventuate. Later on, I'll say a little bit about the hotly contested patenting decision in the European Court of Justice the other day, Brussels, where, if we read the Independent the day after the Brussels decision was announced, it was saying things that sounded to me just like I read 10 years ago when the House Laws Committee was doing its work on stem cells, which is, that there are these therapies, stem cell-based therapies for Parkinson's, for diabetes, for this, that, and the other, just down the road. And this decision is now meaning that these valuable therapies won't get to patients in the way they would have, but the biotech industry has got to relocate away from Europe to more congenial regulatory environments, etc., etc. It's like a replay. So, I think we need to take a hard look at the benefit side of things as well. But there are going to be genuine uncertainties, and the question is, well, how do we respond to these uncertainties? And of course, in regulatory land, in legal land especially, there has been a big movement for applying precautionary thinking, at least where the concerns you have related to environmental damage. And going back to that famous Rio Declaration in the early 1990s, the mantra there is that if you have concerns about serious and irreversible damage to the environment, even though there is some uncertainty scientifically about this, that's not a good reason for not doing anything about it. Well, that doesn't quite say you should do something about it, but at least you shouldn't allow scientific uncertainty to stop you taking regulatory action. So there are quite a lot of questions that we would be asking regulators in relation to the acceptability of the risks they're exposing us to, and whether they're doing an adequate job in relation to that. So that would be the first thing that we would be checking with our regulators to see whether they've got it right in relation to these feared risks in relation to human health and safety and protection of the environment. The second set of questions, because it is a set of questions, will come under the head of legitimacy, and there are many questions that we might want to ask our regulators here. We might want to ask about their title to regulate in the first place. in the way that some people have challenged the authority of, say, ICANN or whoever, to regulate in relation to the internet. There might be a question about whether these people really do have any authority to be regulating. There might be questions about the legitimacy of the procedures that they've used to arrive at the regulatory positions they've arrived at. I mean, has there been public engagement? Have relevant people been consulted? Have they got views on board? The procedural questions. There are questions too about the regulatory instruments that they use, and this is something that I'm I can't talk about it today, but this is something I really have a passion for as a lawyer, because you can see that there are ways in which technologies can be used to fix results or to encourage patterns of behaviour, which sometimes complement the law, but in other cases actually supersede the law. And whilst it might be alarmist to say I can see the rule of law being replaced by a rule of technology, I don't think that that's a totally implausible future, but I can imagine highly managed environments, like international airports, where it's not really the rules and the law that's doing the work, it's just the way the place is laid out, it's just a whole set of technologies that actually achieving that pattern of behaviour. If you want to get on the plane, you basically have to follow the track through security, you just don't have any choice about it. So this is the way for regulators to get the patterns of behaviour that they want. So you can ask whether it's legitimate for regulators to be regulating in this way, even if you broadly approve of the purposes that they are trying to achieve. But I want to just focus on the legitimacy of the substantive regulatory position, i.e. whether regulation is taking up a permissive or a non-permissive prohibitory stance. I mean, regulation can be red light saying, no, you can't do this, or it can be green light, you can do this, or it can be amber light, you can do this, provided you satisfy some certain committees, licensing committees that will authorise you to do this. It can be red, amber, or green. And have the signals that the regulators have taken up here, are they the right signals in terms of what's legitimate? Now, many years ago, by happenstance, got interested in what was going on in biotech, and I went to a symposium at the European Patent Office, where the issue there was about the question about the patentability of the Harvard Oncomax, which was the first big test case of that kind that came to the European Patent Office. Well, on the day I was there, Mary Warnock, who then, to some extent still now really, I think Nora O'Neill has perhaps overtaken Mary Warnock in this respect, but Mary Warnock was regarded as a kind of guru on ethics at this stage. And she said in this symposium, she said, if she had a pound from me every time I quoted this, she'd be doing quite nicely. But it's such a serviceable quote that she said that technology's made all kinds of things possible, were impossible, or unimaginable at an earlier age, ought all these things to be carried into practice. This is the most general ethical question to be asked about genetic engineering, whether plants, animals, or humans. And the question may itself take two forms. In the first place, we may ask whether the benefits promised by the practice are outweighed by its possible harms. This is an ethical question posed in strictly utilitarian form. It entails looking into the future, calculating probabilities, and of course evaluating outcomes. Benefits and harms are not self-evidently identifiable values. Okay. But then secondly, we may ask whether even if the benefits of the practice seem to outweigh the dangers, it nevertheless so outrages our sense of justice or of rights, or of human decency, that it should be prohibited whatever the advantages. Well, I think that is sort of setting things up in a two-tier way, so that you would start with utilitarian ethics, which would be very much like a prudential calculation. The difference between a utilitarian calculation as an ethical calculation and a prudential calculation as an acceptable risk calculation looks to me pretty similar. But having gone through that first tier, you might nevertheless think that there are good reasons ethically for not proceeding with this or for limiting this, because you have concerns about human decency or human rights or justice or something of that kind. Right. Well, in my own writing, I've suggested that in ethics, and particularly in bioethics, there have been two revolutions in our thinking since the middle years of the 20th century. We start with an essentially utilitarian ethic, but I think by the 1970s in most places that is getting challenged very seriously by a human rights ethic. And human rights ethic can sometimes converge with utilitarian thinking, but it's coming from a different place. say no, that this is something we shouldn't be doing, even though there are general utilities here. There are the costs to human rights, to individuals, whose rights must, as Ron Dawkins says, be taken seriously. Their costs are too high. So we have, for quite a long time then, a tension between human rights thinking on the one side, which will always be pressing for the rights to be respected and rights holders to give authorization through informed consent so the thing is going to go ahead. This is where informed consent really belongs, within a human rights or a rights paradigm. We trundle along with that for quite a long time until work in human genetics especially starts encouraging another revolution in bioethics and ethics, which is what I call the dignitarian revolution, where people start saying, no, hang on a minute, it's not utility or the protection of human rights that really matters. The bottom line here for ethics is whether this is going to involve a compromise with human dignity. Does this technology compromise human dignity? Of course, this is an idea that has very little resonance by and large in the UK, but you don't have to travel very far across the channel to find places where this is an extremely resonant idea, particularly in countries that have strong Catholic communities, but also, away from Catholic communities, there's a lot of secular support for the idea that human dignity is something that needs to be defended at all costs. And of all, again to revert to the traffic lights, with these three ethics in play, we have characteristically different traffic light defaults because unless there are conspicuous risks, unless it's really dangerous, the utilitarian ethic will nearly always default to a green light. So if you're an innovator and you want a friendly ethic, utilitarianism is the one to go for because it does tend to default to yes, green light. The dignitarians are, where they see human dignity being compromised, they are definitely, categorically red light. These are things that should not be done. And it's no good saying, but if we don't do this, we will lose these utilities. Utility is just not a consideration. It's not a question of balancing off against, if this compromises human dignity, it is definitely off limits. And even human rights theorists who will say, look, it's got an amber light, in an amber light way, this is something we need to stop and make sure we haven't got rights infringed here, and if we have prima facie infringements, we need to make sure that the door's open through an informed consent. Even that's no good. So you find one case after another where the dignitarians are saying this is something that categorically should be prohibited, being opposed, first of all, by human rights theorists who are pleading the right of competent adults to make their own choices in a free and informed way, and utilitarians are saying, well, what about the collective benefit of doing things this way? So within this particular area, we have a three-way context nowadays, and the 2008 book I wrote was quite pessimistic about regulators being able to tackle, to respond to this conundrum. But they're confronted by three very different constituencies, each very concerned that regulators take up positions that they see as doing the right thing ethically, but almost impossible for these people regulators to satisfy all constituencies. I'm conscious that let me just say a few words about the other two heads of accountability. The third one is effectiveness. Now, an awful lot of regulation is not fit for purpose, and when we get to the innovation audit in a few minutes, we'll see that even some areas of law that are supposed to be doing the job for innovators are quite counterproductive, and we need to take a very hard look to see whether the regulation is fit for the purpose that regulators set for it. Is it doing the job it's supposed to do? And there's a great deal of research, of course, that's been done in my field, within socio-legal studies, that checks on the impact of particular legal interventions, each of which tells you in a micro sort of way what's gone wrong here. And if you were trying to synthesize all this, I would say that we can detect that the problems where a regulation is not as effective as you might hope resides in one of three possible loci. The first problem is that the regulators themselves are the reason why this isn't working out as they wanted it to. That you can lay the fault really at their door, it's their responsibility, because they might be corrupt, or they might be captured, compromised by the regulators. Often the problem for regulators is that they're just not sufficiently resourced. If you wonder why equality agencies or why data protection, information commissioner agencies don't really seem to be able to get a grip on evident social problems. Often it's because they just don't have the resources to make a proper job of it. You know, they're under-resourced, so they're underpowered. The problem can be with the regulators. The problem can be with regulatees. I mean, we assume that regulation, whether it's legal or some other form of regulation, just is a kind of one-way projection onto regulatees who are sort of inert bodies out there. Well, no, I mean, these regulatees have minds of their own, and they're going to respond in their own way, often quite opportunistically, quite strategically, gaming the thing, or just, you know, defining it. Regulatees will often just view regulation as another factor to build into the business case for compliance or non-compliance, where there are strong professional codes like in law, like in ethics, like in education. I mean, we like to think we can do things at our own way. We know how universities should be run. We don't want people telling us how to run university. If someone tries to cut across that and tell us how to do it, you can guarantee that without a huge amount of preparatory work, it is not going to fire in the way the regulators expect. And the same is true with pretty much any profession, and I think scientists too probably don't want to be told how to do their research, how to do their science. So there are going to be not so much cultures of non-compliance, but cultures out there in the regulating world that just don't engage in a straightforward way with what the regulators assume to be the case. So the problem can be that the regulatees are resisting resisting one form or another. The third problem is that the regulators and regulatees might be largely in unison, but there is some third party now intervening in a way that makes it difficult for the regulatory objectives to be achieved. The internet is one example of ways in which domestic regulators have great difficulty sometimes in holding the line on objectives that they have in relation to things like gambling, you know, where they might want their regulatees not to be involved in gambling, or they might want to have certain protections against gambling with minors, but they're defeated by internet gambling providers based in some other jurisdiction who can find ways of feeding in the service which they have very little way of control. But we also bring some of these problems on ourselves, because the third party is not always complete strangers. They can be invited in, and our membership of the European Community or World Trade Organization, signing up to the European Convention on Human Rights, are all ways of inviting third parties to come in and tell us that we can't regulate in the way that we would, without their interference, want to do. Later this week, on Thursday, the European Court of Human Rights, the Grand Chamber, is scheduled to deliver its decision in a case called SH against Austria, which is a case where the Austrian regulation on access to IVF is being challenged. I don't know whether you follow this case, but the Austrians, like Germans, have rather restrictive rules about IVF services. They can be provided to couples who come along with their own sperm or their own egg cells, but they can't use third-party donors for IVF. The case has already been decided in Strasbourg in the lower chamber, where in split decision the majority have held that the Austrian position, even though there was consultation on this in Austria, careful consideration, is out of line with the requirements of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. I suppose the Grand Chamber, maybe again with a split, is going to endorse this. I don't know if that's right, but I suppose they do. And Austria, like Germany, is told that these restrictions, which are dignitary restrictions, are out of line with the commitments they have under the Human Rights Convention. I mean, that's quite a considerable interference, and it's something that, in a sense, you wished it on yourself. But we have to accept that as part of the process of globalisation is that we do invite third parties to be put in positions where they can dictate how we nationally should regulate, and this can again damage the effectiveness of local regulatory interventions. The fourth way in which regulators would be held to account in this initial conversation would be by asking questions about their success in getting connected to new technologies, staying connected once they've made a connection. This is an endemic problem. I mean, again, I think that the problem is more acute as you look at hard legal forms of regulation. So the classic examples I would have of regulation that's become detached or disconnected from the technology or the purposes to which the technology is put are, the Human Fertilisation Embryology Act, the data protection legislation. It's these hard, high-level legal forms that get caught out because, quite rightly, we expect our legislators to have a degree of precision, a high degree of precision, when they lay down the basic ground rules. And the more precise you are in taking a snapshot of the technology or its uses at a particular time, the quicker that gets marooned as the technology moves on and all the purposes or application have changed. So to summarise, in an initial conversation with regulators, so how well are you doing in getting the regulatory environment right? We'd be talking about the question of acceptable risks under the heading of prudence. We'd be talking about legitimacy, effectiveness and connection. But so far, we haven't talked at all about what regulators and their environment are doing for innovators. I mean, are they doing anything to assist innovators? And it's at this point that I want to imagine a conversation with regulators in which we are conducting an audit on innovation, an innovation audit. But the whole focus of this now is, well, what are you doing for innovators? Are you doing as much as you should be doing? Where should I be starting within my 4 heads of prudence, legitimacy, effectiveness and connection? Well, I think I should be starting with regulatory effectiveness because I'm imagining that one of the regulatory purposes, in fact, the overriding regulatory purpose or a key regulatory purpose is to assist desirable innovation. Okay? And what we want to check out in the first instance is whether this is being done effectively. So, the first point, now I'd be very interested if you can add to my list of points that the auditors should have on their sort of checklist. But I've got 6 points that I think auditors should be checking off. And point 1 is whether the regulators are making an optimal use of the instruments they have within the regulatory repertoire. Those people who self-style themselves as smart regulators, smart regulatory people say there are many instruments in the regulatory repertoire and relying on one kind of instrument, particularly the criminal law or command and control kind of instruments, will not normally do the full job. Each instrument has its strengths, each has its weaknesses, but often the smart regulatory style will be one which makes use of a mix of these appropriate instruments. So are regulators making an optimal use of the instruments they have available? One of the things that came out of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics most recent report on donation was that it would be helpful for researchers if the general public had a clearer appreciation of the way in which research does bring forward work, which then gets taken up in clinical applications. So, it's all very well people going around thinking, well, isn't medicine wonderful these days? Doctors seem to be able to do just about everything. But, I mean, obviously, well, that's a slight overstatement. But what they can do is what they're able to do only because researchers have at some stage developed the therapies that are now having clinical applications. So, it's not as though these therapies come out like manna from heaven. They come from research. And if you think that, you like to help doctors, well, you ought to be thinking you ought to help researchers too. So, developing a mentality where the public is more understanding of the needs of researchers and the importance of research for their own future well-being. That kind of education is something that will contribute quite a bit to the regulatory environment and to attempts to innovate. Now, of course, we'll be thinking whether regulators, insofar as they have financial incentives at their disposal, how well they're doing in relation to putting money in the right kind of place. But so the first question would be whether there are regulatory modalities, instruments that could be put to service in a way that would facilitate innovation. The second checkpoint would be whether liability regimes are sufficiently sensitive to the need to protect nascent, innovative enterprises, whether liability regimes are sufficiently attuned to the vulnerability of nascent innovation. I remember many years ago a very impressive book written by Morton Hall. It's called The Transformation of American Law, in which in one of the chapters he's talking about the way in which there were many disputes between railroad companies as they pushed their railroads further west and the agricultural interests of farmers. The problem was that these trains that were running on the railroads sent the sparks out, which set fire to the crops which were adjacent to the railroad tracks. And without special protection for the railroad companies, you would say this is a very clear case of a claim for compensation for nuisance, because, you know, if someone starts a fire on your next door neighbour starts a fire and it sets fire to your land and does damage there, you think, well, that's probably an unreasonable use of their land to your detriment. So this would fit the profile of a pretty standard nuisance claim, unless you put in place some special immunity for the benefit of the nascent industry. So railroad companies got special protection against the claims by the farmers. And you can see the way in which, I read something recently about the early aviation industry, where again waivers of liability were accepted as being valid in circumstances where they wouldn't normally be accepted as valid. And you can see in liability regimes like product liability that there are opportunities for innovators to hide behind development risks defences, or it could be that where you were an innovator who's gone through the right regulatory approvals. In principle, why shouldn't the fact that you've got regulatory clearance, where there's ex ante, scrutiny of your product, why shouldn't you then have a defence, or at least a capped form of liability, if this seems, if this is what it takes. Again, insofar as informed consent is a defence in clinical or research context, you can imagine that we might take a less demanding view of an informed consent where the risks associated with the procedure are still very uncertain. In other words, a whole catalogue of defences and immunities and ceilings on liability that are available within the legal repertoire could be put into play in a way that gives better shielding to early innovative enterprises. David kindly mentioned that I co-edit a journal called Law Innovation Technology, and in the issue that's just coming up, we have a piece in which there's some discussion about this in relation to robotics, that there might be sensitive liability regimes, that are tuned in to give enterprises that are making available quite risky forms of robotics some protection. A third checkpoint would be whether facilitated law is properly geared for innovation. In the early days of e-commerce, there was a rush to make sure that legal regimes recognised the validity of transactions that were made online in the same way as if they'd been made offline. The bulk of contract law is still the contract law for offline transactions, but e-commerce would never have been never have got off the ground unless the ground rules for contracting recognise the validity of the transaction made online. There's also, I think, when we think about facilitated law, we'll try and make sure that we don't buy into particular technologies in the regulation, which then make it difficult for subsequent innovation to improve on the earlier forms of that technology. To that extent, you want some sort of technological neutrality. Phrasing different things, but you want some sort of technological neutrality built into the regulatory framework. A fourth point for the auditors would be to check that the procedures for risk assessment, for ethical clearance, and so on, are as streamlined as possible. The Academy of Medical Sciences has earlier this year issued a report, which I think quite right is complaining about the density of regulation in the area of health research, and if there's a way of streamlining the regulatory requirements, then I think this is fairly unproblematic. It's something that you could ask for improvement. Fifth question, still thinking about whether this is, whether this is doing the job in terms of effectiveness. A fifth question is whether those bits of the regulatory environment that are supposed to be supporting innovation are actually working in the way that they are intended to operate. It might seem a strange question to ask because you think, well, surely these must be pushing in the right direction. And maybe they are generally, but whether they are operating as effectively and without unintended consequences as they should is a question that definitely needs to be asked. And with Graham here, we could no doubt talk about many examples of many instances where we wonder whether IP law, which is, I think, par excellence, the part of the legal part of the regulatory environment that is supposed to be supportive of innovation, is IP law in its various manifestations as supportive as it should be. In relation to patents, it's notorious that we say, look, there are too many patents being issued in relation to biotech and nanotechnologies. We create these patent thickets that, in terms of just too many patents to negotiate. The patents that are issued, as the Neville Council argued some years ago when its reports are sometimes just too broad. There are, I think some people call them patent trolls, but patent parasites out there. These are companies who just have a patent portfolio that they're going to use to negotiate a license. Even though they themselves are not in the business of manufacturing, they are parasites on the patent system, and these are all problems for downstream researchers. So it's all very well protecting these upstream interests, but is this in the end conducive to innovation? And the same will be true with copyright. I think that the regulators need to be careful that rights holders are not being able to enforce their rights in an overbearing way, in a way that is stultifying for innovation. In the US jurisprudence, there's a case back in the 80s involving Sony, where the Sony recording system was challenged as video recording system was challenged as being copyright infringing, and the court in America took the view that they needed to be very sensitive about the risk of cramping innovation by just routinely saying, yes, this is an infringement of copyright. So, some years ago, in one of the big peer-to-peer file sharing cases, the Grokster case, Grokster tried to hide behind the Sony decision, saying that they argued a significant lawful use for their technology. Well, on the facts, it was quite clear that Grokster were inviting people to infringe copyright. But again, there are some quite strong statements in the Grokster case, looking back at Sony, saying, this is the right approach. We're not going to cave in to the copyright holders if we're worried that this is going to be chilling on innovation. So the auditors would again need to make sure that the way IP law is operating, I need to have a look at this, see whether the way IP law is operating is indeed conducive to innovation, or whether it's counterproductive in some respects. And sixthly, and again, sort of a spin-off from this, is that they would need to check that other parts of the regulatory environment are not being expanded or supported in ways that encroach on the innovation supporting elements in an unacceptable way. So, for example, there's a big jurisprudence on the interface between intellectual property rights or intellectual property law and competition law. The question being whether IP rights are anti-competitive and do they fall foul of competition law. And you can see in the European jurisprudence there's some sort of usual fluctuation of views here, but the auditors would need to ask whether if that is a question, whether the innovation supporting elements of the regulatory environment are being corroded by operating other elements without recognising this as doing damage to the innovation. Okay.
Okay,
yeah. Okay, that's right. Okay, that's good. So these would be the things that the auditors should be looking for under the heading of regulatory effectiveness. If our purpose here is to encourage innovation, are the things we're doing in relation to liability, in relation to facilitation and support, are they the appropriate things to be doing? Now, the next port of call for them would be in relation to what I call regulatory prudence, and the question here will be whether the way they are handling questions of the regulatory environment handles questions of acceptable risk is appropriate. The issue here would be whether the regulatory environment gives too much weight to precaution, because that's going to stand in the way of innovation. If you went 180 degrees away from precaution, the view would be that you shouldn't intervene until there is a clear harm, whether it's harm to humans, harm to the environment. You wait for the harm to eventuate before you intervene. Some people talk about this as a theory of procrastination, or approach of procrastination. In his book on the future of the internet, Jonathan Zittrain says quite rightly, I think, that the story of the development of information technology was one in which there was very little regulatory intervention. The people who were concerned with the development of the technology could see problems ahead, could see bridges that they might have to cross, and they weren't quite sure how they would cross them if they got there. But there was no attempt through regulations to try to anticipate this, or to have a moratorium or some sort of precautionary pause. This is presented in a very positive light. So there are some contexts in which you might say, well, look, precaution is completely inappropriate, and procrastination is the right way to do this. And the trick is to figure out where precaution really is appropriate and where it's not, and when it is appropriate, just how it should be exercised. And I think the key to this perhaps is that if the context in which precaution has rooted most strongly is where we see, where there's uncertainty about threats, but where we think those threats relate to the environment or to human health and safety. So to say we can have a procrastination approach where we think that there might be serious or reversible damage to the environment or to humans would seem a bit careless, I think. Well, certainly where that's been considered in the report about 3 years ago by the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution that went through a number of the regulatory options, and they reject this one. They say, well, surely you can't have procrastination as the approach where these are the kind of risks that are on the radar. That just would not be acceptable, even if you have very strong ex-post compensatory regimes. I don't think this would be acceptable in those communities. But anyway, it would be something that would have to be discussed. I mean, is it acceptable that if there is serious and irreversible damage to human health and safety, that we can mop it up after the event by giving a huge damages award? Well, you might say, well, that's more the way the Americans like to regulate affairs, and less the European style. And you might say, well, yes, actually, this in caricature terms is the difference between the balance struck in America and the balance struck in Europe. But this would again be something that the regulators would need to take a look at, certainly the auditors would need to take a look at, to see whether the balance between precaution and procrastination was appropriate for different technologies to which it was applied. When there's really, I think, fitting